Well, hello. Welcome back to the Bible Book by Book, our study on just a quick overview of each of the books of the Bible. Today we're going to talk about Genesis, and Genesis obviously it forms the foundation for understanding the Bible, both in getting the foundation of the stories and kind of the line of the script, so to speak, just the story overall, but also how are we reading the Bible? It's often overlooked, at least in many churches, on what are we expecting when we read the Bible. I like to use the illustration from World War One literature, literature about World War One. There are four great illustrations of this. On Flanders Field, which is a poem that is dedicated to the memory of those who died in the war, and it beautifully captures what the war meant and what it cost. Then you have Goodbye to All That, which is a memoir written by a soldier in World War One. You have All Quiet on the Western Front, which is the great novel of telling the drama that was going on in Germany during World War One. And of course, the First World War, which is a history textbook. Each of these is going to tell us something different about the First World War. Each of these books is going to tell us something different. Each of these books is going to communicate the story of the war in its own unique way. Some are more evocative and more emotionally driven, like the poem on Flanders Field. Some are much more rigorous and intellectual. Obviously, here I'm thinking of the textbook, The First World War. Some of them are meant to dramatize through fiction, like All Quiet on the Western Front. And some, though historically accurate, like the memoir, Goodbye to All That, it's going to be historically accurate, but it's going to be shaped through the lens of one singular individual, as opposed to giving you the broader scope that we might see in others. I bring that up to say that each one of these has its own unique characteristics. Each one of these books will tell you some of the story of World War One, and it's not until you put all of these stories together that you begin to have a great picture of the war. Good historians don't just simply go to the history textbooks. They don't even go simply to the archives of factual information. No, they'll read poems and novels trying to understand the mentality, what the emotional response was to the war. And when we approach the Bible, we have to be creative and understand, hey, this author might be trying to say to us something that we are not expecting, we're not anticipating. This author might be using a literary style that maybe we're not as familiar with. And I say that first to bring up Genesis 1. So often Genesis 1 is read against the backdrop of, did this happen in a historic scientific way? Well, when we read the Bible like that, we fail to see what the author really intended. We fail to see how day 1 is paralleled by day 4, how on day 1 light and darkness are the themes. And on day 4, guess what? Light and darkness are the themes. Day 1 gives the space of light and dark. On day 4, that space is filled by the sun, moon, and stars. On day 2, the sky is divided. So we have water above the sky, we have the sky itself, and then we have water below the sky. Well, on day 5, those spaces are filled with fish and birds and sea monsters. On day 3, dry land is formed, and fruit trees and seeds and nuts and berries, vegetation. with all of its various kinds is created. On day 6, yeah, land animals, things that depend on the land. In other words, this is setting it up as a parallel between the first day, the fourth day, the second day, the fifth day, the third day, the sixth day, and then it's all capped off in humanity, who is God's image. And the image here, we should think of a statue, even an idol in some senses. We should think of that statue that would be set in the temple of God, or that kings would set on the roadsides, an image of them. It was to show who governed that space, who was in charge of that space. It was not just a reminder, though. It was also meant as an authority. This statue is in some ways my proxy for ruling, and that's humanity. Humanity is God's statue, God's image, to rule over this new creation. And so after all of that's done, and this shows you that everything is complete, just in its logical structure, everything's complete, God decides to rest. Now, this rest does not mean like take a day off and do nothing. It means God was at peace. Everything was complete, and God went, this is how it's meant to be. There's no labor, there's no chaos. God is enjoying creation. Not necessarily doing nothing, but enjoying creation in the good ways. So what we're seeing is not a scientific picture. It's not a historical picture. What we're seeing is a theme and a theology develop in the first chapter of Genesis. This is important because if we miss this, if we think it's simply scientific or simply historical, we miss how important order is to the theme of Genesis. Order out of chaos becomes a major theme through Genesis. God is going to take away the chaotic waters and replace them with order. This is why in Genesis 1, as God begins to create, we see, and the earth was, the old translations say, without form and void. I like in confusion and chaos, which is a fairly literal rendering of tovu vohu, which is the Hebrew there. Confusion and chaos. Everything around is in confusion, and God is creating order out of it. If we fail to see that, we're going to fail to see God stepping in at various points to take away the chaos and create order. That's why it's important not to read this chapter, again, as a history, as a linear sequence of events. This is how it happened. No, the author is much the same way that the author of Psalm 19 paints a picture. The author is painting a picture of creation that's supposed to structure it for us. That becomes vital. That becomes vital because then we step into Genesis chapter 3 in our next reading. If you're reading along with some of the online materials, Genesis 3 is all about sin. And that is humanity distorting creation. In other words, humanity taking this good ordered creation and introducing chaos back into it. So the serpent, whoever the serpent is telling humanity you become the judges. God made you to be judges of good and evil. You're supposed to be God's representative. What's the representative do? Judge good and evil, right from wrong. Take that upon yourself. The problem is humanity is not ready for that. And when that happens, chaos is entered into the world again. God's great creation, this thing that gives God rest, is now thrown back into chaos. And we see this in the genealogies as one son of Adam and Eve, that's Seth's line, goes up and up and up. They're increasingly good until the point of the seventh generation. Note here, 7 is never just simply a literal number. It's always symbolic. It means completion. 7 days of creation, God completed. So 7 generations from Adam, their lifestyle is completed. Seth's lifestyle is completed in Enoch in the 7th generation. God takes him because he is so righteous. Meanwhile, on Cain's line, the 7th generation removed from Cain, through Cain's line, is Lamech. What is Lamech? Lamech is a man who takes 2 wives. And I like the translation takes. He's imposing his will on 2 women. A man injures him or insults him, and so he kills the man. And then, in the most arrogant manner, he sets himself up as judge of right and wrong as he proclaims, I will be avenged 70 times for this insult. He gets to set himself up in his mind as the arbitrator of right and wrong. He takes women that he wants. He kills people who he wants. He is the epitome of chaos. And that's Cain's line. This line that feels that at a slight from a brother, we can kill. Now we see in Genesis, as this progresses through chapter 6, God sees the wickedness and decides the flood is necessary. Now, think about this not as, again, a scientific textbook. Because the author, while he's throwing out words like the water covered the land, in our minds, land, ground, earth, is a scientific concept of the physical dirt beneath our feet. The word that is used for the Hebrew mind is much more of a symbolic word, meaning the promise of God. This promised land. So the word that's used actually should bring to mind God's promises. God eliminates that and allows chaos, which is the watery deeps, to return. On day 2, God seals off the water, the chaos, right? And now God lets that back in and covers the good creation. Chaos comes back in, and God says, let me start again. Let's start this. We'll start it back from day 2, carrying a little piece of the old creation back into the new. And yet, that restart of creation doesn't do the trick, and sin continues through, we see through Ham and his son Canaan. And so, through the next couple of chapters, all of Israel's enemies, you'll notice where, if you read the genealogies closely, Canaan, Babylon, Nineveh, and Assyria, Egypt, all of these nations that are eventually going to be hated by the Israelites, they're all from the descendants of Ham. This is a theological, again, it's a theological reading to show that sin is the antithesis of Shem's line, who produces the Hebrews, the Israelites. In other words, this is in ancient cultures, this would have been a polemic against other peoples, but we should also read it as this is saying something theological. The people who commit themselves to sin are the ones who are going to oppose God's people and try to bar them and keep them from inheriting the promises. And that leads us up to chapter 11, which was the last chapter in the first half kind of the book. I know the halves are not evenly split. But the last chapter in the first half of the book is Genesis 11, where the Tower of Babel was being built. This is hilarious. If you read this and you don't laugh, you probably need to work on your sense of humor a little bit. No, it's probably honestly that people don't understand the jokes. Because you start out and these people want to make a name for themselves by building a tower up to heaven. The problem is, we never learn their names. And God, when God wants to know what's going on, God says, hey, I think we need to go down to see what's going on because I can't quite see it from here. The people who are trying to build this tower to have a great name are anonymous. We never know their name. And the tower that is supposed to be so great that it reaches to the heavens, God has trouble seeing it. Now, obviously, this is metaphor, and this is some figurative language. We shouldn't read this again as literal. God can't actually see the earth. That would clash significantly with many other passages. This is a symbolic reading or a metaphorical reading where the author is trying to use this language to show how futile human efforts are. But the human efforts to try to make our name for ourselves ultimately lead to Babylon. That's important because Babylon becomes a seed. It's a mindset later. Babylon is the evil enemy. And this is where it starts. This is the first time we see Babylon in the Bible. And it is a city founded on human arrogance, human pride, and hubris. So that leaves off the first half of the book, really. This, what we call the primordial. It's generally called the primordial history. I really don't like it because there's so little where the Bible is actually trying to be historical. That doesn't mean that there can't be some grains of history or some historical truth in it. It means that whoever wrote this, when he was writing it, that wasn't the forefront of his ideas. What was mainly in focus was, how did God shape this world and why is it the way it is? It's just much more theological than it is historical. But that brings us to this point where we're like, well, humanity's done. We got nothing. Sin has corrupted us so badly that we are just going to wither away again. God, though, has a plan. And this is one of these things that for Christians, typically we just kind of accept it as is, but we never really think about how both ridiculous and great it is at the same time that God would choose one person out of all humanity, one family out of all humanity, to bring hope to the people of the world. We don't really think about it, but this is what God is doing. One person is going to step up and be the champion. And that person is Abraham. And we'll cover Abraham a little bit in a second video for this series. So hopefully you enjoyed this. As always, if these are helpful, let me know. If you have questions that come off of these videos, let me know again. These are kind of a work in progress, so if you have questions, I will try to respond to them, maybe put out a second video. Thanks, hope this is fun, and I'll see you in the next video.